I was interested when I was in graduate school in a couple of things. One was Southern literature, Southern history. I have a minor in women's studies or certificate in women's studies, so I was interested in the ways in which non-combatants claimed authority to write about war, especially working with this feminist theory that was prevalent perhaps in the late 80s, early 1990s about women as pacifists. So I was really curious about Southern women who supported a war effort and talked about war. So that's kind of, it was a meeting of those three things that brought me to the topic. One of my authors, Glasgow, who again was a very popular Southern writer from Virginia, said that what the South needs, what the Southern literature needs is blood to nourish it, but also irony, a bit of critical distance, to be able to write about its most recent past. The ones who participated in this shared effort to create a version of the Confederate War experience, even in the post-war writings as we move into second and third generations, write with support for the Confederacy. Most saw the war as just. There were a few women who told what I would claim as distinctly Southern stories of the war, who were pacifists. Late 1890s, turn of the century, Glasgow wrote 3 books, and she did them in the reverse order. So she wrote one on the populist movement of the 1890s first, and then she did one on the Reconstruction era South, and then she did one on the Civil War. And so I look at all 3 of those novels. So she's figured fairly prominently in my book, but that was her phrase, that what Southern literature needs is blood and irony. So that's where the phrase comes from. Or the most well-known of the authors who wrote during the Civil War itself is a woman named Augusta Jane Evans, who wrote a Civil War novel, Macaria, that came out in the late in the war, 1864, and it looks at what is the proper role for a Confederate woman? How can women in the Confederacy support the war effort and yet remain true to gender conventions? Because that's a tough one to negotiate. What is the proper way to demonstrate female patriotism? Women were not to go out in public and give speeches. They were not to act, they were not to write. Those are all very public performances. So what kind of roles could women play during the war and yet show their support for the war effort? So that's one of those early writings. There are not very many novels that come out during the Civil War era. There are a lot of diaries, journals that come out, and those tend to be published later. Mary Chestnut's the most famous. She kept a wartime diary. She revised it herself in the late 1880s with an eye toward publication. She passed away. It was not published in her lifetime, but her literary executors brought out an edition in 1905. Another edition came out in 1941, I think, and then the edition that scholars are familiar with, that was edited by C. Van Woodward, came out in the early 1980s. These women saw themselves as participating, again, in a shared effort to create a Confederate narrative of the war. And the imperatives might change a bit over time, but they all saw themselves engaged in that particular project. In the 1880s, a popular New York magazine, Century Magazine, ran a series, Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. Grant contributed to that series. A number of generals and soldiers contributed to that series. They solicited manuscripts from folks, and women wrote in, right, to describe what it was like on the home front. And I went to the New York Public Library and looked in the archives of Century Magazine, and these women would attach letters to their manuscripts and say, I'm offering this for to contribute to this series, and if you don't like it, please send it back because I think I can place it elsewhere. So they were very clear that these post-war writings, were designed for publication, and if a publishing firm turned them down in one magazine, that they intended to send it to another magazine, right? They felt very strongly that they had something important to say, and they were going to make sure that there was an outlet that would let them say it. Margaret Mitchell and Mary Johnston, who was writing in, I think her books came out in 1911, 1912, who has this remarkably unromantic, unsentimental account of the Civil War. It's very different from Margaret Mitchell's memory or her narrative of the war. I would perhaps throw in I always call her the poor woman. She wasn't poor, but poor in the sense that she had the misfortune of publishing a Civil War novel shortly after Margaret Mitchell. Margaret Mitchell's novel came out, and she had again a different kind of idea about the war, and she was angry. I mean, she wrote to a friend something to the effect of, "Margaret Mitchell, damn her. They say it took her 10 years to write that book. Why couldn't it have taken her 12?" All right, because her book comes out maybe 6 months, 8 months after Margaret Mitchell's book, but all the trade had been sucked out by Margaret Mitchell. Readers just weren't buying Civil War novels after Gone with the Wind. Some critics wondered whether women wrote those battle scenes. Is that possible? Some wrote to publishers, right? Did Mary Johnston really write these scenes? Sometimes it was expressed from readers with I was surprised that a woman could write battle this way. So not necessarily doubt that you actually wrote it, but surprised that you had written it. Margaret Mitchell armed herself with a long list of books that she purportedly used to research writing Gone with the Wind, because I think she knew that she might come under attack, even though battle is perhaps a tenth of that. There's very little war in Margaret Mitchell's story, but she had a long list of some of these very diaries that I'm talking about, other novels that I talk about in this book, histories that she read in preparation so that she had a kind of authenticity to her book. For the women who participated in it, they took this work quite seriously and claimed a kind of authority to write about the war. And the second point is just how expansive and accommodating the market was for these women, that they found, and I'm not saying every woman who ever wrote anything ever got it published, but I think I was surprised to see how many novels got published at any given time by Southern women, or how many diaries, or how many versions of a Confederate girlhood can get published in any given year? Apparently a lot, right? So I think those are two important takeaways from this study, that there was an eager audience that met its desire through this work that these women did.